Suit up, strap in, warm the tires, and leave on yellow. Time for the MitsuTimes podcast, presented by MitsuTimes.org, the home of the fastest Mitsubishi cars. With your host, Josh.
Picture this. It's night. Not city night. There's no other lights other than the moon. The kind of night where darkness just feels heavy. You're standing about 600 feet from the beginning of a rally stage. You're 15 feet off the road surface. The road is wet. It's not flooded. Just enough rain to leave a thin sheen across the pavement. The air already smells like fuel and damp dirt. There's moisture just hanging in the air. You can smell the rain-soaked earth. You can tell from looking at it that the road surface is cold and rough. You hear the tinging of hot metal cooling somewhere nearby. And if you've ever spent enough time around old cars, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because old cars have a smell. The gasoline, the oil, the heat, the old metal. It's like the car itself is somehow alive. And somewhere in the darkness, there's an engine idling. You can't see the car, at least not yet. Not clearly, but there's a faint silhouette. The moonlight catches the edge of a round roofline. You can hardly make out a set of dim headlights reflecting against the wet pavement. But mostly, you can hear it. It doesn't sound modern. It sounds industrial. There's no engine computer smoothing out everything. There's no active exhaust. It sounds mechanical, honest, raw. Like every moving part is introducing itself. You can hear the valves working. You can feel the vibration. The engine sounds like it was designed not to be comfortable. It sounds like it was designed to work. Designed with a purpose. Built by people who cared far more about durability than luxury. People who believed machines earn their reputation by surviving. And for a moment, before we talk about rally stages, before we talk about Evos, before we talk about turbos, blow-off valves, trophies, and championship banners, you realize something. You have no idea what that car is sitting in the darkness. Because the Mitsubishi story, it didn't begin with a hero car. It didn't begin with a racing legend. It began much, much earlier. Long before the world knew the Three Diamonds. Long before anyone imagined Mitsubishi would become a motorsports name. Because before Mitsubishi built race cars, they built machines. And those machines were built to survive. And that is where our story begins. Now, let me ask you something. When you think of Mitsubishi Motorsports, what do you picture? Seriously. Close your eyes for a second and think about it. Because I'd bet most of you listening are picturing the same thing. A white Evo, red Marlboro-style livery covering the body, mud splattered all over it, headlights cutting through the fog, gravel flying in the air behind it. That turbo spool. You hear the anti-lock cracking through the trees, going around corners in a four-wheel drift. And somewhere in your head, you can almost hear a co-driver screaming pace notes.
Left 4, overcrest tightens, don't cut.
Because for a lot of people, that is Mitsubishi. That image is burned into automotive history. And honestly, I get it. Because Rally Mitsubishi was chaos in the best possible way. There was attitude to it. The cars always looked so aggressive. The drivers looked fearless. And the whole thing had this feeling like it was just one bad decision away from becoming a disaster. And somehow, I feel like that made it even cooler. But some of you, when you think about Mitsubishi Motorsports, maybe your brain goes somewhere completely different. Maybe you picture the desert, heat waves rising off the ground, miles and miles of sand stretching to the horizon as far as the eye can see. And suddenly, here comes a Pajero, absolutely hauling across the landscape like it has somewhere very important to be. Like somebody told it the finish line was closing in 5 minutes. And if you know Dakar history, you already know what I'm talking about. Mitsubishi didn't just win Dakar. At one point, they practically moved in and started paying rent. Because for years, it felt like every time somebody thought they had figured Mitsubishi out, another Pajero would show up and ruin everyone's plans. Now, for those of us in the U.S., when we think about Mitsubishi Motorsports, our brain probably goes somewhere completely different. We picture Norwalk, Ohio in the late summer, humidity hanging in the air, the smell of methanol and burnt rubber just drifting through the pits, golf carts and scooters buzzing around, people leaning over engine bays, friends standing around a laptop, discussing logs and arguing over numbers. And somewhere in the staging lanes, there's a DSM just waiting. It's one of those cars that looks completely innocent from 20 feet away. And then you walk around back and you notice a parachute hanging off. And the announcer calls the lane. The car rolls forward. The crowd perks up, starts paying attention. Because if you've ever been to the shootout, you know there are certain cars people stop what they're doing, get to the fence, get to the stands, and watch. The revs come up. The anti-lag starts barking. The whole car starts vibrating so hard you can see the Lexan window pulsating. Boost climbs. The driver bumps into the beams, and for a split second, everything is somehow extremely loud and so quiet at the same time. And then, all four tires, the slicks wrinkle, the rear end squats, the front end lifts just enough. The turbo screams, and that little DSM absolutely leaves like somebody just hit the fast forward button. And somehow, 40-year-old Mitsubishis still find ways to scare modern cars. You'll hear me say this a lot during this series, but that's just Mitsubishi energy. And if you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you've seen some of those. Because Mitsubishi Motorsports eventually became everything. Drag racing, rally racing, circuit racing, time attack, Dakar, hill climbs, autocross, no prep, all of it. And through every era, Mitsubishi somehow built machines that attracted a very specific type of person. The kind of person that looks at something difficult and says, yeah, I can make that faster. And that makes sense, honestly, because Mitsubishi's glory years were so loud. Not just literally, although, if we're honest, yes, literally. Very literally, actually. But they were loud culturally. These cars made noise in the automotive world. People noticed them. People argued about them. People built entire identities around them. People still do, myself, in fact. There are still people in the garages at midnight fighting rusty bolts and chasing horsepower because of something Mitsubishi built decades ago. Think about it. That kind of loyalty doesn't happen by accident. But here's the thing. Mitsubishi didn't start as a racing company. Mitsubishi didn't even start as a car company. Mitsubishi started as something else entirely. And that's why this story to me is so good. Because the Mitsubishi Motorsports story isn't just about race cars. It isn't about trophies. It isn't about horsepower. It's about an industrial giant slowly realizing that the machines that they were building could become something more, something beyond practical, beyond transportation, beyond utility. Because at some point, somewhere along the way, Mitsubishi stopped asking, can we build a machine that works? And they started asking, can we build a machine that wins? And once that question gets asked, everything changes. Because history is full of companies that built machines, but only a few built legends. And Mitsubishi was about to discover it might be one of them. Now, welcome back to the MitsuTimes podcast. I'm Josh, and today we're kicking off a new series, a long-term series. We're going to walk through Mitsubishi's motorsports history, step by step, year by year, era by era. Welcome to part 1 of the history of Mitsubishi Motorsports, presented by Rick's Racing. In this series, we are not skipping straight to the Evo. We're not going to skip straight to the rally dominance. We're going to earn it. And today we're starting at the very beginning. This is Mitsubishi in its infancy, before the trophies, before the headlines, before the myth. This is the story of Mitsubishi before Mitsubishi was cool. All right, let's start with a question that sounds stupid, but it actually isn't, I promise. What is Mitsubishi? Seriously, what is it? Because like I said earlier, Mitsubishi means something to a lot of different people. Because when you say Mitsubishi, most people in the U.S. might think of the Eclipse. Most people around the world might think of the Evo, the 3000 GT, the Lancer, the Galant. And if they're really casual, they might say, oh, Mitsubishi, they make Outlanders, right? No. Mitsubishi isn't like Honda. It's not like Toyota. It's not even like its parent company, Nissan. Those companies feel like car companies first. Mitsubishi's different. Mitsubishi is so much more. Mitsubishi is like a giant industrial beast that just also happens to make cars. And I feel like you can tell that just by looking at what they were doing before they were making passenger cars. Because Mitsubishi began in 1870. Now, let's put that into perspective. In 1870, cars didn't exist the way we think about them. There was no motorsports. There was no racing culture. Hell, there weren't even paved roads in a lot of places yet. But Mitsubishi was founded by a man named Yataro Iwasaki. Before we go any further, let's talk briefly about the man who started all of this. Because without him, there is no Mitsubishi history. Yataro Iwasaki was born in 1835 in the Kochi region of Japan during a period where the country was changing rapidly. He didn't come from wealth or automotive roots because remember, cars didn't exist yet. He was born into a family with samurai connections, but by the time Iwasaki came of age, Japan was beginning to modernize, and the old social structures were shifting. He proved to be ambitious, sharp, and intensely business-minded. Eventually, he found opportunities working with the Tosa clan, where he gained experience in trade and commerce. Yataro Iwasaki didn't start a car company. He started a shipping company. Now, I can hear you. I know what you're thinking. Okay, cool. Boats, what does that have to do with race cars? Be patient, because this matters. Now, shipping is not glamorous. It's not about style. Shipping is about one thing: survival. If your ship breaks down, you don't just pull over. If your engine fails in the middle of the ocean, that's it. That's the end. So the companies that thrive in shipping are obsessed with reliability. And Mitsubishi was born into that world. Now, before we get too far, let's talk about the name and the logo. Mitsu in Japanese means 3. Bishi means something like diamond shaped. So Mitsubishi basically translates to 3 diamonds. Now, if you think about it, the logo is one of the most recognizable in the world. You don't even need the name Mitsubishi underneath it. People see the 3 diamonds, they know exactly what it means. It's simple, it's strong. It looks like a stamp, like a mark of ownership, like something you'd see on a shipping crate or a steel beam or the side of a factory. And not so much a cute little badge on a commuter car. This logo was never meant to be friendly. It was meant to represent strength. And here's where I want to pause for a second and just say something. A lot of Mitsubishi fans don't realize how deep Mitsubishi history actually goes. Because Mitsubishi isn't just Mitsubishi Motors. That's what most of us know and love. It's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. They make a lot of the turbos, MHI. Mitsubishi Electric. Probably seen a lot of that. Fuses and switches and stuff. Mitsubishi Chemical. They make all kinds of stuff. Most notably golf clubs that are very popular. It's a massive network. Your Nikon camera was made by a company owned by Mitsubishi Motorsports. That Four Roses bourbon that you see on the shelf at your bar, at your local bar, was made by a company that's owned by Mitsubishi. And Mitsubishi Motors is just one branch of a huge tree. So right away, the Mitsubishi story is different. It's not just a company that started in a garage building sports cars. This is a company that started by moving goods across oceans. And if you know anything about motorsports, you know that reliability is everything. Fast doesn't matter if you don't finish. And Mitsubishi roots are built around finishing. Now, as you probably guessed, Mitsubishi didn't stay in shipping. As Japan modernized, Mitsubishi expanded into everything: shipbuilding, heavy equipment, steel production, and eventually aviation. And here's the part where the Mitsubishi story gets a little complicated. Mitsubishi was deeply involved in Japan's wartime industrial machine. And during World War II, Mitsubishi built aircraft, most famously the Mitsubishi A6M0, more commonly just called the Zero. Now, I'm not here to romanticize war. War is awful. I've seen it firsthand. It leaves scars that last generations. But we do have to acknowledge that this period was very important for Mitsubishi from an engineering standpoint, because aircraft engineering is no joke. And the Zero was only part of the story. Mitsubishi wasn't just building ships anymore. They were building machines that operated under conditions that engineers could not simulate in labs or on paper. Machines that were meant to survive enormous stress. Machines that had to be lightweight, efficient, and mechanically dependable. And once Mitsubishi entered aviation, they went all in. Most people know the Zero, and honestly, it makes sense. Early in the war, the Zero developed a reputation that almost felt mythical. Long range, highly maneuverable, lightweight, fast, and Mitsubishi could just pump these things out. For a period of time, it shocked opponents because it simply performed differently than most aircraft it faced. But Mitsubishi's role in wartime engineering went beyond one airplane. They also built aircraft like the Mitsubishi G4M, a long-range bomber known by Allied forces by the nickname Betty. Now, from an engineering perspective, the G4M represented another challenge entirely. Long-range aircraft demand fuel efficiency, structural design, weight reduction, reliability, because flying long distance over open water leaves very little room for mistake. You can't just pull over. You either make it home or you don't. And Mitsubishi engineers kept confronting problems like, how do we make something lighter? How do we make it stronger? How do we improve performance without sacrificing reliability? Those questions start sounding very familiar, because decades later, those are motorsports questions. And Mitsubishi didn't stop there. They also build aircraft engines, and honestly, engines are where it gets really interesting, because building a competitive aircraft engine means balancing impossible demands. More power, less weight, better cooling, greater efficiency, higher reliability. And those goals fight each other constantly. You make something lighter, well, then it becomes weak. You make more power, and then durability suffers. You increase performance, temperatures rise. Engineering becomes a balancing act. And during this era, Mitsubishi engineers were learning those lessons under enormous pressure. Now, let me kick this back and connect it with motorsports for a second, because I know some listeners are probably thinking, okay, thanks for the history lesson, I guess. When do we get back to cars? Hear me out. This matters. Think about some of Mitsubishi's later motorsport successes. Rally cars designed for brutal conditions. Dakar vehicles crossing deserts. High-performance turbocharged engines. Cars known for durability under extreme punishment. That mindset didn't appear out of nowhere. The engineers who came later inherited decades of lessons. Lessons about materials, about cooling, about aerodynamics, lessons about performance under stress. And those ideas become part of Mitsubishi's DNA. Not because of war itself, but because difficult engineering problems force people to innovate. And although the world around Mitsubishi was changing rapidly, one thing stayed surprisingly consistent. Build it strong, build it intelligently, and build it to survive. Because eventually, those same ideas would find their way onto racetracks. And once they did, everything changed. After the war, when Mitsubishi was rebuilding, Mitsubishi had to transform. Thankfully, the country no longer needed fighter planes. Japan needed transportation. It needed infrastructure. It needed mobility. And Mitsubishi was going to have to reinvent itself. After World War II, Japan was rebuilding from scratch. Factories had been destroyed. Cities had been devastated. Infrastructure was damaged. Entire industries had to be rebuilt. The economy had to restart. And Mitsubishi, like many major industrial groups in Japan, was broken. Following the war, the massive Mitsubishi organization that once operated as one industrial powerhouse was divided into smaller companies. The name survived, the people survived, the engineering talent survived. But Mitsubishi wasn't the unstoppable industrial empire it once had been. Not anymore. And suddenly the challenge changed. The question was no longer, how do we build machines of war? And now the question became, how do we build machines that help people live? Here's the important part. Japan in the late 1940s and early 1950s didn't want sports cars. Nobody cared about quarter mile times. Nobody cared about lap records. Nobody cared about horsepower. People cared about getting to work, moving cargo, rebuilding their businesses, feeding their families, and keeping the country moving. Transportation wasn't about excitement. Transportation was about survival. And Mitsubishi stepped directly into that role. They built trucks, commercial vehicles, utility vehicles, buses, machines meant to work long hours under difficult conditions. And some of these vehicles became incredibly important to Japan's rebuilding effort. Take the Mitsubishi Fuso line. Today, people hear Fuso and they think about medium-duty trucks driving around cities. A lot of times we see them box trucks. But the roots go way back. Mitsubishi had already experimented with bus production before the war. But after the war, Fuso name became increasingly important because Japan needed transportation systems restored. People needed to move. Goods needed to move. Businesses needed their supply chains. And buses became part of reconnecting communities. Now, stop and imagine for a second. You're not building a sports car. You're building something expected to carry dozens of people every day, day after day, mile after mile, year after year. No excuses, no drama, just reliability. That mindset matters a lot. And Mitsubishi also continued developing work-focused vehicles and utility platforms. Because in post-war Japan, trucks weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. Farmers needed them. Businesses needed them. Construction crews needed them. Entire industries depended on machines simply showing up every morning and doing their job. And that starts shaping Mitsubishi's engineering culture. Because when the customer depends on a vehicle to feed their family, failure isn't inconvenient. Failure cannot be an option. And then something interesting starts to happen. As the economy began slowly improving, Japan itself began changing. Roads improved, industry expanded, the cities grew, and people gradually started wanting more than just basic transportation. Not luxuries, not race cars, not yet. But they wanted personal passenger vehicles, something affordable, something for everyday people. And Mitsubishi had to figure out how to transition from building machines that worked to building machines that people wanted. Now, before we get to the Mitsubishi 500, and trust me, we're getting there, you can already see the company's identity forming. Mitsubishi wasn't trying to compete through style. They certainly weren't trying to be flashy. They weren't chasing image or clout. Mitsubishi was becoming obsessed with dependability, durability, function, engineering. They wanted to become the company people trusted. And if you think about it, that should sound familiar to all of us. Because decades later, what is Mitsubishi known for in motorsports? Cars that can take punishments. Cars that can take gravel stages. Cars that can survive the open desert. Cars that survive 8,000 RPM launches on a prep surface. Cars that survive abuse that would destroy lesser machines. That identity didn't just randomly appear during the Evo years. It didn't suddenly show up in rally. It was forming right here in the 1950s, in those buses, in those trucks, in those utility vehicles, and these machines that were certainly not designed for speed, but for responsibility. Because before Mitsubishi built race cars, they built vehicles people depended on. And maybe that's exactly why they became so good at building vehicles that refused to quit. Because when your company grows up learning how to build machines for difficult jobs, surviving difficult conditions eventually becomes second nature, becomes easy without realizing it. Mitsubishi was laying the groundwork for a motorsports philosophy that would follow them for decades. Build it strong, build it intelligently, and build it to last. I want to start this section off before somebody jumps in here and says, hold on, what about the Model A? Yes, the Mitsubishi Model A absolutely existed, and it is technically Mitsubishi's first attempt at a passenger car. The Model A debuted in 1917, making it one of the earliest series production automobiles in Japan. And here's why I'm not going to spend much time on it. The Model A was less of a production success and more of a experiment. They only made 22 of them. That's it. The problem was simple. It was expensive, very expensive. It was largely hand-built and based heavily on a European luxury car, which made it difficult to compete with imported mass-produced vehicles coming into Japan at the time. So eventually Mitsubishi just stopped production. And then they stepped away from passenger car production for decades. So that's why for this story, we're treating the Mitsubishi 500 as the real beginning. Not because the Model A didn't matter, because it did. But because the Mitsubishi 500 marks the moment Mitsubishi truly entered the modern automotive world and began building vehicles at scale. And more importantly for our story here, the Mitsubishi 500 eventually leads us towards motorsports. And that path changes everything. It's the reason that you and I are here right now. In 1960, Mitsubishi introduced something extremely important. This wasn't a race car. This wasn't a rally weapon. It wasn't a high horsepower monster. It was a tiny, tiny two-door sedan called the Mitsubishi 500. And at first glance, it doesn't look like the beginning of a motorsports legacy. It looks simple, small, almost frail. But this little car mattered. Because the Mitsubishi 500 was Mitsubishi's first post-war passenger car built by Shin Mitsubishi Heavy Industries before Mitsubishi Motors existed as the company we know it today. It was produced from 1960 to 1962 and used a rear engine, rear-wheel drive, layout with a lightweight body. The standard version had a 493cc air-cooled overhead valve 2-cylinder engine. This was paired with a 3-speed manual transmission. Now think about that. 493cc. That's smaller than most motorcycle engines today. And if somebody told you they were entering an international motorsports event with a car powered by a 493cc 2-cylinder engine, you'd probably laugh in their face. But in 1960 Japan, that made sense. The point wasn't brute force. The point was efficiency, lightweight, simplicity, reliability. The car weighed just over 1,000 pounds. So even though it didn't have much power, it also didn't have a whole lot of weight to move. And Mitsubishi engineers were not just throwing parts together. They were thinking carefully about how to make this tiny car usable. The body was a monocoque, meaning the body and chassis structure were integrated together instead of sitting on a separate frame like most cars at the time. This helped keep the car light, yet strong. And Mitsubishi's goal was practical but ambitious at the time. Seat 4 people, reach roughly 60 mile per hour or 100K with a very small engine. Then in 1961, Mitsubishi improved it. They released the Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe. This is the version that matters most for our motorsports origin story. The Super Deluxe received an enlarged 594cc overhead valve 2-cylinder engine, still air-cooled, still rear-mounted, and still driving the rear wheels through a 3-speed manual transmission. The bigger engine gave it better acceleration and durability, and that little bump in displacement would become very important because now Mitsubishi had something it could test, something it could prove, something it could send into competition. And here's the wild part. The Mitsubishi 500 was tied to one of Japan's earliest aerodynamic developmental milestones. Mitsubishi's own heritage material says that the 500 was tested in a wind tunnel, and that detail matters because this was still the early 1960s. Wind tunnel work on a small Japanese passenger car was not normal everyday stuff, but this showed that Mitsubishi was already treating even a tiny economy car like an engineering problem, not just a transportation appliance. And that matters because aerodynamics is free speed, especially when you're not working with a whole lot of horsepower. And if you only have 2 cylinders, you cannot just overpower the drag. You have to cheat the air. You have to make the car efficient. And that is such an early Mitsubishi thing. Not flashy, not loud, just smart engineering. And now the year's 1962. The Macau Grand Prix. Now, if you only know Macau today as a wild street circuit that barriers inches from the car, understand this. It was already the perfect place to prove a point. Macau was not a smooth, predictable test track. It was a street circuit. Tight, narrow, unforgiving. The kind of place where mistakes do not fade quietly. They happen in front of everybody. And Mitsubishi showed up with this 500 Super Deluxe, their first international motorsports entry. Not with some purpose-built monster, not with a glamorous sports car with a tiny rear engine sedan. Now, imagine the scene. You're in Macau, 1962. The streets are just lined with people. There are bigger, louder, more dramatic cars around. The Lotus 22, for example, Jaguar Type E. And then here comes this Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe tiny little economy car. I wasn't there, obviously, but I would imagine it wasn't very intimidating. And I would be willing to bet nobody was looking at this car and thinking, you know, this is the beginning of a dynasty. But that's okay. Mitsubishi wasn't there to look intimidating. They were there to finish. They were there to prove the car. And in the Class A category, that's exactly what happened. Mitsubishi's own history records show that the Mitsubishi 500 took first, second, and third in its class at the Macau Grand Prix. Their global history page specifically notes that the Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe won the Class A victory in 1962, and the Mitsubishi Heritage page says that the 500 dominated the top 3 places in Class A. That's huge, because this was not just a race result. This was Mitsubishi's public statement. The car worked. The engineering worked. The company had only recently stepped into passenger cars, could now say, we entered international motorsports and we won our class. I mean, not just won, they swept the podium. First, second, third. Now, doing my research, you might see some Mitsubishi history blurbs that say they set a track record at Macau. Mitsubishi Motorsports North America's history page says that Mitsubishi won its first entry into international motorsports and immediately set a track record. But according to some other articles at the time, I think the careful way to say this on this podcast is the Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe did not become the fastest car at the entire Macau Grand Prix. That wouldn't make sense. But within its class, it delivered a record-setting performance and swept the podium. And for a new passenger car manufacturer, that was exactly the kind of headline they needed. And this is where Mitsubishi learned something very important. Motorsports can do what advertising cannot. An advertisement can tell people a car is dependable, but a race can prove it. An advertisement can say a car is efficient, but a race can prove it. An advertisement can say that the engineering is clever, but a race can prove it. And that little Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe did exactly that. It went to Macau and gave Mitsubishi credibility. And I love this part of the story because it feels so opposite of what Mitsubishi would become later on. It was a small, air-cooled, rear-engine, 2-cylinder sedan. That's the beginning. Not glamorous, not obvious, but somehow very Mitsubishi. Because from the start, the formula was there. Build it light, build it efficient, build it strong. Then send it somewhere difficult and let's see if it survives. But in Macau in 1962, the Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe did more than survive. It won. It dominated. And once Mitsubishi had that feeling, once the engineers, the executives, and the public saw that Mitsubishi could compete internationally and come home with a class victory, the question changed. It was no longer, can Mitsubishi build a passenger car? Now the question became, what else can Mitsubishi build? And that question will lead directly into our Colt era. But the first spark, the first proof, was that Mitsubishi 500 Super Deluxe at Macau, a tiny car, but a huge moment. Now, also in the early 1960s, Mitsubishi began using the name Colt. The Colt name is legendary to some of us. If you're a real Mitsubishi nerd, you hear Colt and you immediately think of a few things: lightweight, early tuning potential, and the Mirage's better looking sibling. Eventually, some genuinely cool little performance cars, right? But in the beginning, the Colt was not a hot hatch. It wasn't some turbocharged giant killer. It wasn't a car that people were putting on posters on their bedroom walls. Colt was Mitsubishi trying to establish a compact car identity. And honestly, that sounds less exciting than it actually was. Because what Mitsubishi was accidentally building was a foundation. The first Colt models started arriving in the early 1960s, like I said. One of the earliest was the Mitsubishi Colt 600. And this thing was tiny, very tiny. It's like riding around in a bathtub. The Colt 600 used an air-cooled 594cc two-cylinder engine mounted in the rear again, carrying over ideas from the 500. The power wasn't going to pin you to your seat for sure, but that wasn't the point. The point was efficiency, durability, low cost. That's it. But you have to remember, this era wasn't about performance. Not yet. We hadn't got there yet. This was about mobility. This was about helping everyday people buy transportation. Mitsubishi kept evolving this formula. Soon came cars like the Mitsubishi Colt 1000. And this was important because suddenly Mitsubishi moved from a tiny rear engine car towards a more conventional compact layout. The Colt 1000 introduced a 977cc inline four-cylinder, and that mattered because now Mitsubishi had moved into four-cylinder territory, what they're known for today. This engine produced roughly 50 horsepower, and now it had a 4-speed manual or a 3-speed semi-automatic. Now, I know what you're thinking. 50 horsepower doesn't sound like a lot. Your average riding mower starts off with 50 horsepower. But in the early 1960s, that represented progress. And more importantly, it represented potential. Because racers don't just see horsepower, they see possibility. And this is where things start getting really interesting, in my opinion. Because Mitsubishi naturally gravitated towards these compact cars. They weren't building giant V8 land yachts. They weren't trying to compete with huge luxury sedans. They were building smaller, efficient vehicles. And here's the thing. Compact cars are naturally good for racing. Not because they're powerful, but because they're light. And weight is the enemy of speed. Even today, the formula is simple. If you want to go faster, you either add power or you remove weight. And for most of us, removing weight is cheaper. This means that these little Colts accidentally had a huge advantage. And Mitsubishi slowly kept improving the Colt family. By the mid-1960s, they introduced the Mitsubishi Colt 800. Now, this one gets interesting because the Colt 800 used the unique 843cc overhead cam two-stroke inline 3-cylinder. This little overhead cam 3-cylinder represented Mitsubishi becoming more ambitious, more willing to experiment. And that engine was paired with a 4-speed manual transmission, giving drivers more flexibility and improving performance. But again, small steps, right? However, these were important steps. And while all this was happening, Mitsubishi was learning something else. Motorsport works. Because after Macau, Mitsubishi had seen firsthand what competition could do. Racing created headlines. Racing gave people confidence. So Mitsubishi started entering early Colts into competition. Now, this wasn't Formula One. This wasn't giant international racing campaigns. These were smaller events, regional events, production-based car racing. Like a touring style competition, endurance races. The kind of races where ordinary cars could prove extraordinary durability. And this eventually led into what Mitsubishi later described as the 5-time Grand Prix winning Colt F Series. Now again, this doesn't mean these tiny Colts were out there defeating every race on Earth. This referred to class victories in Grand Prix style events and touring categories. But class wins matter. Because class wins prove consistency. Class wins prove engineering. And Mitsubishi kept finding success over and over and over again. 5 times. You can't contribute that to luck. That's a pattern. Imagine being at one of these races, cars lined up, engines buzzing, crowds gathering, and among all these competitors, there's Mitsubishi. Still relatively new, still building confidence, and still figuring things out. These little Colts kept showing up, kept finishing, kept proving themselves. And that started changing how people saw Mitsubishi. Because suddenly, they weren't just building transportation. They were building competitors. And I think this is really where Mitsubishi begins discovering its motorsport personality. It's not flashy. It's not arrogant. It's not trying to overwhelm people with horsepower or displacement. Instead, it's about building something lightweight, building something durable, building something that survives. Then send it into competition and see what happens. And eventually, that philosophy would create some very famous cars. But right now, it was happening with these tiny little Colts. And honestly, that feels very Mitsubishi. Now, before we go any further, I want to stop for a moment and zoom out. Because when we say Mitsubishi was beginning to enter motorsports in the early 1960s, we need to understand what motorsports itself looked like in the world at the time. Because the early 1960s were so fascinating when it comes to cars and motorsports. Depending on where you live, motorsports meant something completely different. And Mitsubishi's early path looked very different from what was happening everywhere else. Let's start in the United States. Because in America, horsepower fever was spreading. This was the beginning of the muscle car era. Big engines, big displacement, and big personalities. Manufacturers were figuring out that speed sold cars. The formula was simple. Take a mid-sized car, stuff a giant V8 under the hood, see what happens. And suddenly you start seeing machines like the Pontiac GTO, the Ford Mustang, and later monsters like the Chevelle SS entering the conversation. Now, some of these arrived a little later in the decade, but the mindset had already started forming. And motorsports reflected that. America loved drag racing, stock car racing, straight line speed, and quarter-mile battles. These huge V8s were making ridiculous noises. Bigger was better, louder was better. But meanwhile, halfway around the world, Mitsubishi was showing up with tiny compact cars powered by engines with the same displacement as 2 cylinders of an American muscle car. Different strategy, very different strategy. Now, let's jump to Europe, because Europe was playing an entirely different game. Europe had a deep racing culture already. Road racing, Grand Prix competition, endurance events. Manufacturers were obsessed with handling, balance, engineering precision. This was the era where names like Ferrari, Porsche, Lotus were becoming increasingly important. European racing philosophy often looked like this: lightweight, chassis balance, aerodynamics, mechanical efficiency. And honestly, that sounds a lot closer to what Mitsubishi would eventually become. Not giant horsepower, just smart engineering. Getting the most out of what you have. I think a lot of us can relate to that. But even then, Mitsubishi wasn't operating at that level yet. Not even close. Ferrari was chasing Grand Prix glory. Mitsubishi was trying to prove that a tiny economy car could survive these competitions. Then we go down under to Australia. Australia had developed a motorsports personality all its own, because Australian racing culture had this attitude of take a production car and beat the absolute life out of it. In the 1960s, it was all about long-distance endurance races, road races, production car competition, and eventually a touring car culture. Australian motorsports rewarded durability, toughness, machines that could survive a lot of punishment. And honestly, that starts sounding very Mitsubishi again, because Australia loved cars that worked hard. And Mitsubishi would eventually build plenty of those. But in the early 1960s, Australia was beginning to develop the culture that would later create legendary rivalries. The focus wasn't elegance, it was survival. And Mitsubishi engineers would have understood that language immediately. But let's go back to Japan. Motorsports still felt different, because Japan's automotive industry was younger, smaller, still learning, still evolving. Manufacturers weren't even trying to build halo cars. They were just trying to build trust with the public. Remember, at this time, the country was still rebuilding. These manufacturers were still proving themselves. And so early motorsports in Japan often became something closer to a test session under pressure. There was a lot of production car racing, compact classes, touring events, regional competitions. Races where manufacturers could prove our suspension works, our cooling works, our engine survives, and our cars can handle plenty of punishment. And suddenly, Mitsubishi's strategy makes perfect sense, because Mitsubishi wasn't trying to overpower anyone. They were just trying to learn. They were trying to prove themselves. And they were still trying to build confidence in the public. But for me, this is why I love this era. Because when you compare Mitsubishi to the rest of the world, you realize something. America was chasing horsepower. Europe was chasing precision. Australia was chasing endurance and toughness, and Mitsubishi was still trying to figure out who Mitsubishi was. The ingredients were there, they just needed to be put together. They had the lightweight platforms, the engineering, a willingness to compete, and a growing realization that motorsports could be more than entertainment. It was honestly a laboratory, a classroom, a proving ground. And once Mitsubishi discovered that, that's when things started to change. Because soon Mitsubishi would stop simply participating and start building an identity. And this is really where Mitsubishi Motorsports' personality starts to form. Because later, when Mitsubishi becomes legendary, the legend isn't built on style. It's built on grit. Think about Mitsubishi's most iconic performance vehicles. The Evo, built to dominate rally stages. The Pajero, built to conquer Dakar. The 3000 GT VR4, built as a high-tech monster. The DSM cars, as chaotic as they were built with performance ambition underneath. Mitsubishi always had a built-for-battle vibe. And it started right here in the early 1960s. In this era, Mitsubishi wasn't trying to be glamorous. They were just trying to be respected, trying to be trusted. And motorsports is one of the fastest ways to earn respect. Because if you survive it, if you enter motorsports and fail, it's embarrassing. If your car breaks down publicly, everyone notices. Motorsports is high risk, but it's also a huge reward. And Mitsubishi was approaching that risk carefully, building the foundation, building the confidence, and preparing to step into a much larger stage. But by the late 1960s, Mitsubishi had reached an important point. They had passenger cars. They had compact car identity. They had an industrial engineering strength. And Japan's car market was now expanding fast. But Mitsubishi still didn't have what they truly needed. They didn't have a reputation. Not yet. They weren't Toyota. They weren't Honda. They were Mitsubishi, a company known for industry, not for racing. But that was about to change. Because Mitsubishi was preparing to enter motorsports in a serious way. And the name that begins to matter, Galant. And once Galant enters the story, Mitsubishi stops crawling and starts walking. And once Mitsubishi starts walking, it doesn't take a couple steps before they start running. And that's where episode 2 will begin. But this is a wrap on episode 1 of our MitsuTimes history of Mitsubishi Motorsports Part 1. Remember, this was the infancy stage, the foundation, the before the legend era. Next time, we're going to get into the years where Mitsubishi begins to prove itself publicly, where competition stops being an experiment and starts becoming a mission. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Let us know. Make sure you follow all the MitsuTimes social medias. Give us some feedback there as well. And if you got a favorite obscure Mitsubishi fact, send it in. I will definitely put it in because we're going to go as deep as we can in this series. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the MitsuTimes podcast. Check out our Instagram and Facebook for daily updates. Get added to our list by going to MitsuTimes.org and clicking Submit a Slip. Thank you to all of our sponsors.